if a metamodern Christianity is not just a fringe movement, but it rather is a way that will afford larger cross-section of society to find some kind of a new redemptive engagement, then I'd be very interested that we address at least briefly some of the core esoteric pillars of the Christian faith. First, how do we integrate the different dimensions of the Jesus person? Because when I look at it, there are maybe 5 or 6 dimensions of the Jesus person. How do we integrate these into a metamodern context? And then also, is there a way in which we can bring the Trinitarian Nicene Creed view into this? Mm-hmm. And I have some suggestions and thoughts around that. And then also, can we bring into this exploration a way of commenting about the different schools of thought around Christian eschatology, and especially the premillennial, the postmillennial schools of thoughts that are describing different end of days narratives? And is there actually a delicious opportunity to recognize some of these inside a metamodern context? Because if you are going to find a way to bridge to the larger cross-section of society, then these are going to be some of your challenges. I think the recent statistics is that certainly in America, there are maybe more than a quarter, perhaps some say even more than a third of the people believe in some kind of an end of days scenarios in more fully or more tangentially. So how do we weave a story to that? Ultimately, what I'm putting on the table, and maybe that's a whole larger conversation, how can we tell a Christian story that is not just backward looking, but forward looking? That's the bigger conundrum that I believe you are trying to address.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, so there's so much there, and I'd love to dig into each of those. So how about I'll throw out some general thoughts on that, and then whichever one you want to start with. But what I would say, right, is that, so I think we've named this situation that we're in, the meaning crisis. We've named the lived experience of the problem there. And we've talked a little bit about this kind of arc of the development of people's conceptions of the divine and unfolding and all that, and how that kind of, leads us to the present moment. What I see is a kind of crossroads that we're facing right now, is that as we enter this very challenging moment in a meaning crisis where people are suffering and experiencing this meaninglessness and despair and nihilism, there's a strong desire to turn back and look for some way of looking at the world, some worldview, some religion that seems like, oh, that's when meaning was working well for people, so let's go do that. And so you're exactly right. I think that what I'm trying to do is to particularly articulate a forward-looking perspective on Christianity rather than a backward-looking perspective. Because, and I see this, I'm seeing it a lot at the moment, and it's very disconcerting to me because of the consequences of making this kind of move. A lot of people around me are just trying to give up, as it were, on the modern or the postmodern way of being and jump back into a more traditional or pre-modern way of looking at Christianity as their solution to the meaning crisis. And I think that approach is doomed to fail, not just individually, but collectively. I think we're bound to get ourselves collectively, socially, culturally, in a lot of trouble if we think we can just ignore all the situations that are kind of facing us in the complexity of our moment and try to, return to some different worldview based on pre-modern notions of Christianity. So that is in many ways the backdrop of this project. That's one path on that crossroads. The other path is the forward-looking.
Let me just insert, the point you're making is very important and is a central point that I address time and again when we do a parallel epochal trace and story, where the key insight is why it is doomed to fail. Because we are in a phase transition. And in a phase transition, there is no way to put the genie back in the bottle, or there is no way to try to re-engage an older operating system. The challenge is, how do you take the best of that ancient operating system and indeed harvest from it the elements that you need to honor and integrate, and hospice what needs to be left, and make a move that ultimately is ready to configure a new operating system, which I think is...
And that's exactly right. And I think the argument that I want to make is that it's a theological argument, I guess you could say, is that that's also what God wants, meaning if there is this parallel track and God is evolving and we are participating in that, and that is this kind of divine dance that we've been engaging with through the evolutionary process of culture and of religion, then, just as, I'm going to be 36 next year, I don't want on my 36th birthday to like have to go relive high school, or, it's like, oh, I've got to go live puberty again. It's like, oh man, I don't want to go back to that. I want to go forward. I want to build on what I've already done and continue the dreams that I've set up for myself and live the arc of this thing. I'm trying to move forward. I don't want to go back. And so in that sense, you could imagine that if this process is one in which we are co-participating with the divine to unfold into new directions, then it's antagonistic to the divine will, you could say, to want to just revert back to some earlier way of thinking. So that's a theological way of putting the issue. Simply a sociological way of putting the issue is when you try to go back to an earlier operating system in a different, more complex situation, you get some kind of profound cultural pathology. And a great example is Nazism, right? Is when you get a society that's been profoundly disrupted and disturbed. It's grappling with a loss of meaning. It's grappling with despair. And so what does it do? It turns to a sense of meaning that it thinks it can grasp onto, and that has a very kind of old style God King, mythologically informed traditionalist sort of pre-modern aura to it. And the result is millions and millions of people dead. It's war, it's genocide, it's, bad things. So that's another way of thinking about what happens when we try to just, go back. So yeah, if we're not going to break it down to a more, to a simpler way of looking at this, we need to break through. And so there is a version, I believe, of Christianity on the other side of the complexity of the world that we're in. And it's one that I find very beautiful, but it's a similar thing of continuity and discontinuity in the way that you're saying, right? Where we want to carry forward what is there in the tradition, and we want to leave behind ways of thinking about the tradition that we've since kind of moved beyond. And there's many instances we could also draw on from our own individual development of these sorts of things. I don't know, just as an example, right? Like when you're a kid, oh no, I'm a boy, oh, she's a girl, she's got cooties, and it's sort of like, okay, that's a very immature way of thinking about that. And then you grow up and then you actually get to have a full, rich relationship with your wife. And you're like, the benefits of moving beyond, of maturing, of growing, of learning are obvious. But I think learning in general presents us with this, that it's inherently something that opens us and creates new affordances, new freedoms, new insights. So I think we want to carry forward the Christian tradition by embracing all that we've learned and moved through, and carry forward the best and leave behind the things that were important in earlier moments of God's evolution, but are not the current driving edge. So those are my general reflections. And then you raised a number of really important aspects to that. So whichever of those you'd like to explore. Let
me make a bridging comment to that, and then let's explore the few dimensions or persons in Jesus. Mm-hmm. The bridging comment I'll offer is that there is a developmental and evolutionary reason for regressive cycles. I mean, even at a personal level, we get triggered is another name for a regressive cycle. Something happens that we have not worked out that we get triggered by, whether you call it shadow element, or whether in the new work that we're developing in terms of the portals into the soul. I'm describing that as the ghosts. When I get re-triggered to a down the timeline, I actually have an opportunity to become enlightened about something that I never integrated before. That is true culturally as well. We do have regressive cycles. So you could say that through the cycle that occurred in the 60s of the previous century, there was a liberation, several liberation moves that were on the march, and they also involved certain regressive dimensions, and so on and so forth. If you look through the 90s, there was a liberation move, but it also unleashed certain regressive cycles, and we are now through a profound, I believe, a profound transitional phase shift move, and inside it is expressing itself with some regressive moves. So I'm interested that we still try to address the Jesus character, because so just at the simplistic level, and some of it was inspired actually by listening to some of your work. So I decided I could name 5 or 6 dimensions of Jesus. Let me run them by you and then ask you to make a comment as to how will you integrate these into a metamodern context. So there is the literal Jesus. That's the Jesus we read in the scripture, and we truly believe that his word, the words are the words that he spoke, and that these are the miracles that he performed. Number 1, the literal Jesus. Number 2, the parable Jesus. So we read the scriptures and we assimilate these as teachable tales that we need to learn and to interpret into a modern context. That's the second dimension. There is the historic Jesus, I think the way you name that. This is where we look to find the whatever archaeological, historic traces that we can identify with the geographies, the person, and whatever there is that we can track down back in history in terms of archaeological relics. And then there is the church culture Jesus, which is more of a narrative about the values and the socioeconomic ideals that he represents, and how perhaps these ideals can be translated into this modern or postmodern or metamodern context. And then I believe there is still an esoteric mystery school Jesus that I would describe as the soul and the actual Christ-led spirit that inspired the person to become the embodied enactment of that creational divine matrimony, of the idea that there is something about that God-human relationship where it is in the marriage of the two, the matrimony of the two, that there is a third element that is the perhaps evolutionary impulse that's arising, and perhaps that's one way of narrating the Trinitarian principle in this new context. And then there is the 6th dimension, which is the Christ idea is not just something that happened back at that time, but is a field of potential, a plasma state potential that we can live into, and each person can find as part of the field of their potential, such that there is a permission for a person to enter a communion of sort, where there is a continual revelation of what is your life and your personal spiritual endeavor is about, and you can do that in dialogue with a Jesus Christ figure, or you can do that in dialogue with a Buddha figure, or you could do that with a goddess, or you could do this with any other divine choreography or cosmology that you can choose to assimilate. So that's just me offering you some tools to play with of how will you choose to integrate the Jesus dimension into a metamodern exploration.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And I like I like these different dimensions that you've named. I definitely think that they allow us to they bring some insight to this. So there's a lot of ways one could go about thinking about this, answering a question like that. Maybe one, and so this doesn't exhaust my thoughts on this, but one thought that occurs to me, I wrote down these different dimensions, and then I started kind of trying to organize them a little bit on some kind of a spectrum, some kind of an axis. Um, and so working with these six dimensions, I want to pose to you the idea, what if we think about these as being on some kind of a continuum? And I would, and again, this is the first time I've heard these, so I'm just playing with this, but I'll throw this out to you. So if we move from, let's say, the order I would suggest is historic to literal to church culture to parable to archetypal is the word I would give that thing, and then the esoteric finally, as being sort of a spectrum that we could locate these different dimensions on, and that all offer something unique, and they all have their values. They maybe also all have their challenges or problematics to them. But I do think that I would probably say that as you move along that spectrum, there's going to be a deeper value that I'm finding there in the metamodern Christian framework. Which means that if we start with the historic, right, that would be where I would place the least amount of integrative value relative to the tradition, right? And this brings back my own, story that I got into, which is that I moved through a traditional faith and then studied the historic Jesus. That was actually really the moment that I gave up my traditional faith, was when I studied the historical Jesus studies of the 20th century. Because I could say a lot about that and have another context, but briefly, I just feel like if we want to hang our hat, if Christianity wants to hang its hat on history, I think it will suffer. I don't think that is the right way of thinking about it. I think there are many ways that are justified in saying that even the ancients didn't think that was the right way of thinking about it. But I also think that we really need to appreciate the novel insights of each of these moments in God's evolution. And that modern moment was a really important one, where things got clarified in a way, and where thinking historically about, let's say, the Bible, let's just say the Gospels, the person of Jesus, the way that was done in that historic moment of modernity gave us new insights that I really think we need to integrate and carry forward. So I'm not saying that we don't integrate the historic, but I think that when we integrate the historic, we actually have to wind up dealing with a very different picture of Jesus than is the sort of Jesus that I think gives us the most spiritually robust kind of frame of engagement. So I'd situate that first. Then there's the literal, which I took as you saying, talking about the words on the page, sort of. So there's the Jesus on the page. And the Jesus on the page is again, that's going to be different from the historic Jesus, because we're getting this filtered through the gospel writers and that sort of thing. So here we're dealing with the Jesus of story. And here, I think there's even more value if we can really sink into that. I studied the Bible as literature. That I feel like is a very powerful lens and a perspective on the biblical materials that can be very meaningful and significant, where we can appreciate the value of stories on their own terms rather than have to peg them to some historical occurrence, right? We can say that the story of Jonah and the whale is a profound story, whether or not we actually think there was a Jonah and whether he got swallowed by a whale and this sort of a thing, right? So the literal Jesus, in that sense, I think there's a lot that can come through there. I next had parable, but I actually then decided to swap that with church culture, because I think that would be sort of next in the sequence, where it's not just the story, it's the whole ethos, it's the whole aura, it's the story of the stories, and the creation of new stories and new traditions and new images and all of that stuff that comes through. And here I really get excited about what the Christian tradition has to offer, because the cultural Christianity, we can say, that spans 2,000 years is so rich and encompasses everything from early hymns to Bach's oratorios to Michelangelo's art on the Sistine Chapel, to Greek Orthodox icons, and on and on and on. There's so much there that I think that we should carry that forward so much. And I think any metamodern Christian should appreciate the whole treasure trove of Christian cultural history as there for engagement. And then I have the parable Jesus, which again, these could be swapped. I don't know, but I think that when you read the parables in Jesus's, stories, there's something there that is truly timeless, that more than the theology and the interpretations of who Jesus was or how he might have fit into certain kinds of notions of a, messianic figure or whatnot. When you read the parable of the Good Samaritan, or you read the parable of the prodigal son, these endure. These speak to us at a deep soul level that I feel like that's scripture, right? That's it. That is enduring scripture. More could be said about that, but just to round this off, then I get to the archetypal. And I think that for me is where probably I tend to resonate most with Jesus, which is to say Christ as the Christ archetype, which is, and you were explaining that well earlier, that there's this way that we can find that Christ in us, in our own moment, that there's some way that we can show up in the world in a Christ-like fashion, and by drawing on all of what we've been talking about. But I think that this is a very expansive notion then of Jesus, that we can even see, you could say, the Jesus in Achilles. We could see we could see the Christ, in Buddha, these sorts of things. We're at this archetypal level where we're really at a very profound, universal kind of engagement and deep psychological kind of engagement with these things. And there, I would say, is really, I think that those are the depths that a metamodern Christianity should really plumb. And then just real quick, the last thing I'll say on the esoteric element is this, to me, is the most mysterious, right? I think that there's possibly a way in which you could think of the esoteric as somehow wrapping all of these together and finding some truth finding total truth in all of these in some way that maybe is a bit beyond me, who still wants to try to put things in sequences and map things out. And maybe there's some really insightful, profound, esoteric relationship to Christ that is able to even look at the historic Christ and read some profound truth there in some sense. And so I leave that very much as sort of my horizon would be. Anyway, so that's kind of my take.
Yeah, well, let me build on this. I know we're kind of stretching our time, but let me do one more concretized example with actually a build on the reordering that you offered. So if I decided to abide and double click with the story of the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. So I'll go with your ordering. So the historic trace, I will actually look to travel to these places, which I have been born and raised in Israel, and often been all over the area of Sea of Galilee. So I will go to these places and try to imagine what actually occurred when that occurred, and whether there is any archaeological trace. And so that was the historic, number 1. And you proposed that number 2 would be?
Literal.
The literal. Okay, so I'll be in that place, which I have, and I'll actually read the words right there. So I get a scriptural experience in the geography, and I try to imagine what parts of that story can actually be traced to some kind of a 5 senses experience, and bring it to life in my imagination. And then you suggested that you'd bring to number 3 indeed the church message. So there is, when you contemplate that story, a moral about distribution of means and so on and so forth. And there is a socioeconomic vision that perhaps is locked in this story. And then there is perhaps the parable dimension of the story, which is that one way to consider it is that, okay, religious teachings can offer nourishment to the multitude beyond just what is in the bread and the fish.
Man does not live on bread alone. Yeah.
That's right. Which leads me to the esoteric dimension, because the esoteric dimension would...
Well, I put the archetypal next.
Okay, the archetypal next. So what would you say to the archetypal dimension in that?
In that story, I would say that Christ represents abundance, a giving of the self, the realization of fullness where there was emptiness, the sense of also a kind of faithfulness that by living into hope and the right orientation to reality, that abundance and richness can come about. So notions like that, probably.
Well, this is beautiful because what it reveals is that often indeed an archetypal formulation is one step removed from the essence spirit realm. And what was, and here is how I will narrate the esoteric description of that moment in time, out of which we can see the archetypal formulation that you offered, which is that could we imagine that Jesus, in his moment of Christ communion, is able to address a large group of people, and that in that communion, which is something that envelops his own experience, there is something that he is able to transfer to people which is invisible. But we understand that, Brendan, that in peak experiences, when you are in communion with an energetic property that is luminescent and compelling, that it carries even the power to reroute and supersede the biological programming of I need to eat because it's noon, or we understand that a lot of the digestive process is habitual, and that there are ways in which unique peak experience can override, at least in a transitional way, that drive, that experience. So could it be that what is being described in this story is a moment of communion, where the five loaves represent in that the way that communion is charging and transmitting to the five energetic centers of the human constitution, which we know by 5 fingers and 5 senses and 5 extensions to the body. So we understand that there is something fivefold about the human system, and that the 2 fish are representative of the higher communion capacity, if you like, the higher mental capacity and the higher emotional capacity, and that those 2 dimensions or energetic centers are addressed and metaphorically described through the 2 fish. And that those faculties are entering a flow state. And when you are in flow state, to which the fish would be a good metaphor, then at least for a certain time inside the collective state, you are not so worried about just getting your next meal because you are getting something else in that ecstatic state. That would be one way to describe an esoteric, energy-infused, inspired dimension of the story that will then truly be archetypally described as abundance that is generated out of that ecology, conductive ecology, that was afforded in the communion that he was generating with those hundreds or thousands of people around him.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so yeah, it's fascinating. I feel like these are the places where I feel like I'd love to have more conversations, because this butts up against this thing that I feel like is really worth parsing in some really important ways. And I'm not close to moving in those directions, but there's something there. I guess I'll put it this way, right? Like there are ways that we can move in those directions that actually look a lot like going back, and there are ways that we can move in those directions that are moving forward. And so I want to be very careful that we don't slip into moving back by heading into the esoteric in certain ways that where we could be going forward. So that I think is a big question mark for me, and it's my own learning edge, growth edge. I'm really open to exploring that. And I think in some ways, metamodern Christianity is sort of also comfortable. Maybe I'm projecting. It's kind of comfortable being okay at like reaching a kind of archetypal ceiling almost, as it were. I don't want to speak for other people so much, but I do think that there's something about, like, if you are familiar with spiral dynamics or integral theory, right, there's something in which you can relate the metamodern to the yellow or the teal, whereas both those systems have something beyond that, whether that's turquoise or whatever. And so I think that there's historically already been in some metamodern conversations this appreciation of, like, there's a liminality to the metamodern that's sort of right on the edge of both. It's like beyond just rationalist thought, and it's in the level of systems thinking and sort of hyper rationalist thought, you could say. But it's on that threshold, and maybe there's something beyond that threshold. But I think we also want to like move into whatever is beyond that threshold in a way that doesn't lose touch with what's down here, because otherwise, yeah, again, a lot of pathologies can enter in. So I'm most excited for what can happen in those dialogue spaces.
Well, let's develop this conversation in a part 2, or perhaps on your channel. And I hear the two concerns. You want for there to be a way to develop without losing touch with the ground, inside of which implicit there is a message: can we explore these next moves without needing to regress to pre-modern belief systems? And my challenge to us about this is, okay, let's do that. And can we, as we do that, search to expand a way of addressing these that is prepared to integrate scientific discoveries, but is not bound by too physicalist, too materialist definition of science, where the trajectory is almost just one directional. And I would like to propose that there is a way to perhaps explore complexification and learning in the universe, not as one vector, but perhaps a 7-fold or a 9-fold vectored exploration, in which there may be a way to integrate some mystery school ideas without needing to lose touch with modern and postmodern reality, and without abandoning scientific ideas, and at the same time perhaps pushing the envelope beyond the physicalist orthodoxy and dogmatic version of current scientific exploration.
Yeah. And I think that if we can do that well, then that really would be the cutting edge of, spiritual and Christian thought, and, in any other tradition as well that's able to do that.
Along with our website at portalsofperception.org, Portals is also available on YouTube and on all podcast platforms, as well as social media. You can become an active member and join the conversation in community events. And you can help us get the word out by liking this content and by sharing it with your friends.